Babysitting alien apex predators wasn't in the job description. Neither was the smell of raw meat, or the bone-rattling snarls echoing through the sterile halls. They thought she was soft, weak, a hairless ape. They forgot humans didn't survive Earth by being gentle. We survived by being louder. Sweat pooled at the base of Chloe's spine, turning the cheap polyester of her uniform into a second, highly uncomfortable skin. She stood in the centre of a foyer that cost more than her entire residential block back in Sector 4, staring at the polished obsidian floor. The air in the penthouse was thick, hyperoxygenated, and smelled distinctly of crushed pine needles mixed with old, dried blood. It made the back of her throat itch. Chloe didn't take this job because she possessed some deep maternal instinct for galactic integration. She took it because the orbital station's atmospheric tax was due on Friday, and if she didn't pay it, the life support in her cramped studio would be throttled down to a wheezing 60%. Footsteps shook the floorboards, heavy, deliberate thuds that reverberated through the soles of Chloe's worn boots. Arthur and Beatrice stepped into the light. Even after 6 months on the station, the sheer mass of the locals made Chloe's primate brain scream to find a tall tree. They stood 9 feet tall, a terrifying hybrid of reptilian bulk and mammalian agility. Thick, charcoal-grey hides covered in sparse, coarse bristles armoured their bodies. Their muzzles were blunt and wide, housing rows of serrated teeth that interlocked like industrial gears. They wore clothes, of course, tailored, flowing garments of spun silver and dark wool that looked absurdly delicate against their musculature. They had adopted Western names to make dealings with the human labour caste easier. It was a patronising gesture, like naming a hurricane Kevin. "You are the human caregiver," Beatrice said. Her voice wasn't a sound so much as a vibration in Chloe's chest cavity. It was smooth, but held the underlying threat of a rock slide. "Yes, ma'am," Chloe said, keeping her voice level. She forced herself to maintain eye contact, focusing on the bridge of Beatrice's broad snout rather than the golden slit-pupilled eyes that seemed to dissect her. "Chloe, from the agency." Arthur stepped forward, adjusting a cufflink on his massive wrist. He smelled sharply of ozone and expensive cologne, a jarring contrast to the underlying feral musk. "We have never employed a human before. Your species is fragile. We usually hire from the chitin sectors. They have carapaces." "I assure you, Mr. Arthur, I'm quite resilient," Chloe lied. Her heart fluttered against her ribs like a trapped moth. "And I have excellent references." Arthur snorted. A tiny puff of hot air ruffled Chloe's bangs. "We shall see. The boys are in the rec room, Leo and Wyatt. They are entering their primary growth phase. Their energy levels are elevated. You're not to strike them. You're not to lock them in the containment hold unless they draw blood. Your primary task is to ensure they consume their protein rations and do not destroy the load-bearing walls. Protein rations and structural integrity. Understood." Chloe clutched her datapad like a shield. "We return at 2200 hours, Beatrice added, leaning down. The sheer gravitational pull of her presence made Chloe want to step back, but she locked her knees. Beatrice's breath was hot, reeking of rare steak and copper. "Do not let them intimidate you, human. They will smell your fear. It is a game to them." Great, Chloe thought. Babysitting is a blood sport. She nodded sharply. "Have a wonderful evening. I'll handle the boys." The parents didn't offer a goodbye. They simply turned, their massive bulk moving with an unsettling liquid grace, and exited through the reinforced airlock. The heavy steel doors slid shut with a pneumatic hiss, and the locking mechanisms engaged with a heavy, definitive thunk. Silence descended on the penthouse. It was an expensive silence, insulated from the constant hum and grind of the space station outside. Then, a sound shattered it. It was a wet, tearing noise, followed by the high-pitched screech of yielding metal, coming from the sunken living area down the hall. Chloe closed her eyes, took a deep breath of the overly rich air, and let it out in a slow, ragged sigh. She rubbed her temples, feeling the beginnings of a tension headache. Rent, groceries, the atmospheric tax. She repeated the list in her head like a mantra. She opened her eyes, squared her shoulders, and marched down the hallway. The walls were lined with abstract alien art, mostly jagged metal sculptures that looked like medieval torture devices. The floor transitioned from obsidian to a thick, spongy material that swallowed her footsteps. She rounded the corner into the living room and stopped dead. The room was a disaster zone. The furniture, which looked like it was upholstered in thick rhinoceros leather, had been shoved to the perimeters. In the centre of the room, sitting amidst a pile of shredded synthetic cushions and shattered glass, were Leo and Wyatt. They were cubs, only in the sense that they hadn't reached their parents' towering 9-foot height. They were easily 7 feet tall, corded with lean, adolescent muscle, their hides as lighter shade of slate grey. Currently, they were playing a brutal game of tug-of-war with what looked like a multi-thousand-credit housekeeping drone. Sparks showered the expensive rug as Wyatt ripped a mechanical limb from the chassis. He tossed it over his shoulder where it bounced off a priceless-looking vase. Chloe swallowed hard. The saliva tasted like copper. Just kids, she told herself. Just really, really big kids with teeth that can bite through an engine block. "Hey!" Chloe yelled, clapping her hands together. The sound was pathetically small in the cavernous room. The cubs didn't even flinch. They continued tearing at the drone, chittering to each other in low guttural clicks. Chloe's annoyance flared, burning away the top layer of her fear. She was tired. She had worked a 12-hour shift at the hydroponics bay before coming here. Her feet hurt, her back ached, and she was not about to let 2 overgrown iguanas ruin her chance at a paycheck. She marched forward, stepping over a sparking wire, and clapped again, harder this time. I said, "Hey, drop the drone, it's dinner time." Slowly the tearing sounds stopped. Leo, the larger of the two, turned his head, his eyes bright and predatory, locked onto her. He dropped the mangled drone, the heavy metal clattering against the floor. He didn't stand up, instead he shifted his weight, crouching low to the ground. His nostrils flared, taking in her scent. Wyatt mirrored his brother, dropping the scrap metal and turning his massive head. They didn't look like children caught making a mess. They looked like wolves evaluating a stray sheep that had wandered into their den. The silence stretched, pulling taut like a wire about to snap. Chloe stood her ground, though every instinct forged by millions of years of mammalian evolution was screaming at her to run for the airlock. Kitchen. Now. Chloe pointed toward the adjoining room, aiming for the authoritative tone her mother used to use when Chloe tracked mud into the house. It came out slightly higher than intended. Leo let out a sound. It wasn't a laugh and it wasn't a growl. It was a low, rhythmic thumping deep in his chest, a sub-vocal rumble that Chloe felt in her teeth before she actually heard it. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated amusement. He rose to his feet. Standing at his full height, he loomed over Chloe's 5'4" frame. He took a step forward, his claws, thick, black, and sharp as obsidian shards, clicked rhythmically against the floorboards. Click, clack, click, clack. He wasn't walking, he was stalking. Wyatt flanked him, moving to Chloe's right. They were establishing a perimeter, herding her. Chloe felt a cold sweat break out across her ribs. "Don't let them smell your fear," Beatrice had said. What a useless piece of advice. You might as well tell a bleeding person not to let the sharks taste iron. "Stop right there," Chloe commanded, holding up a hand. Leo paused, tilting his massive head. He reached out with a thick, leathery hand and deliberately knocked a decorative glass orb off a side table. It shattered into 100 glittering pieces across the floor. He looked at Chloe, his golden eyes unblinking, waiting for her reaction. It was classic toddler behavior, scaled up to a lethal degree. He was testing the boundaries, testing her. "Pick that up," Chloe said, her voice shaking slightly. Leo snorted, a blast of hot, raw meat breath hitting Chloe's face. He stepped over the glass, closing the distance. He was now less than 3 feet away. The sheer mass of him blocked out the ambient light from the station's artificial sun shining through the viewport. Wyatt moved behind her. She could hear the soft scrape of his tail against the floor. They were playing with her. To them, she wasn't a caregiver. She was a novelty. A fragile, fleshy toy left behind by their parents. Chloe backed up, a tactical retreat moving toward the kitchen. The kitchen meant counters, heavy pans, a barrier. She kept her eyes on Leo, but her peripheral vision tracked Wyatt. She stepped onto the cold, polished tiles of the culinary prep area. The cubs followed, their pace matching hers perfectly. If she sped up, they sped up. If she paused, they paused. The psychological pressure was suffocating. She backed into the central island, the cold edge of the synthetic granite pressing hard against her lower spine. She was trapped. On the counter behind her sat two massive stainless steel vats, the protein rations. They looked and smelled like a mixture of raw ground beef, bone marrow, and sulfur. Chloe reached back without looking, gripping the edge of one of the metal bowls. "Dinner," she said, her voice cracking. She cleared her throat and tried again. "Eat your dinner." Leo leaned down. His face was mere inches from hers. The texture of his hide was rugged, like scarred leather, and she could see the individual bristles standing on end. He opened his jaws, revealing a terrifying array of interlocking teeth and a dark purple tongue. A thick string of saliva bridged his upper and lower fangs. He wasn't going to bite her. Not yet. He wanted her to break. He wanted her to run, to scream, to cry, so the game could truly begin. Wyatt nudged her roughly from the side with his snout, nearly knocking her off balance. Chloe gripped the counter to stay upright. The smell of them, musk, copper, and apex predator, was overwhelming. I am not dying for minimum wage, Chloe thought. The cynicism was a life raft in an ocean of panic. I am not getting eaten by two spoiled rich kids in a penthouse. Leo lowered his head until his snout was level with her chest. He inhaled deeply, a wet, snuffling sound drinking in the scent of her terror. Then he dropped his jaw and let out a roar. It wasn't a loud sound at first. It started as a vibration in the floor, travelling up Chloe's legs and settling in her stomach. Then it erupted, a concussive blast of sound that tore through the air, shaking the dust from the recessed lighting fixtures and vibrating the stainless steel appliances around them. It was the sound of a creature designed by nature to paralyze its prey with sheer sonic force. Chloe closed her eyes, her hands flying to her ears. The noise echoed in her skull, making her dizzy. Her knees buckled slightly. The roar faded, replaced by the sound of the cubs' rhythmic, chest-deep chittering. They were laughing. They had won. The soft human was broken. Chloe opened her eyes. Leo was staring at her, a smug, triumphant look in his golden eyes. He reached out a clawed finger and tapped her lightly on the shoulder, a condescending dismissal. Something inside Chloe fractured. It wasn't a clean break. It was jagged and ugly. It was the culmination of a 12-hour shift, bleeding blister feet, the threat of eviction, the patronizing tone of the alien mother, and the sheer, unadulterated disrespect of these overgrown reptiles. Fear vanished. In its place, a hot, dark tide of primate rage surged upward. Millions of years of human evolution, the survival instinct of the hairless ape that had conquered a death world through sheer, stubborn spite, woke up in the back of her brain. She didn't think. She didn't calculate. Chloe grabbed the edge of the stainless steel vat filled with 50 pounds of raw protein. With strength she didn't know she possessed, she shoved it across the granite island. It collided with the second vat, creating a deafening metallic clang that rang like a gunshot. The cubs flinched, stepping back. Chloe stepped forward. She didn't cower. She didn't shrink. She made herself big, throwing her shoulders back, her chest out, her hands gripping the edge of the counter like she was preparing to rip it from the floor. She locked eyes with Leo. The golden, slit pupils widened in momentary confusion. Prey didn't step forward. Prey didn't make noise. Chloe drew in a breath. She pulled air past the asthma she'd had since childhood, past the recycled stale oxygen of the lower levels, deep into the bottom of her lungs. She filled herself until her chest ached, and then she roared back. It wasn't a scream. Screams were born of terror, high, thin, and brittle, meant to call for rescue from a stronger ally. This was a roar. It began not in her throat, but deep in her exhausted, undernourished gut. It bypassed her rational cortex entirely, tapping straight into the hindbrain, the ancient, buried sequence of human DNA that remembered being hunted on the sun-baked savannas of a high-gravity death world. It was a raw, unhinged, feral bellow that tore upward from her diaphragm, scraping her trachea raw like swallowed gravel on the way out. It was a guttural, furious sound, entirely devoid of civilization, grace, or professional decorum. It held all the pent-up, boiling frustration of a species that had to bleed for every inch of dirt they had ever claimed, magnified by a 12-hour hydroponic shift, throbbing blisters, and the crushing, suffocating weight of an impending eviction notice. Spit flew from Chloe's lips, landing on the pristine stainless steel of the kitchen island. The sound violently bounced off the sterile acoustic ceiling tiles, harsh and deafeningly loud. It wasn't a beautifully harmonic roar like a lion's. It was the frequency of pure, chaotic, desperate aggression. It was the sound of a cornered hominid holding a sharp rock, screaming utter defiance at a predator twice its size. For a terrifying, stretched-out second, Chloe's vision went entirely black around the edges, tunneling her sight onto the massive alien face in front of her. Her throat burned as if she had just inhaled vaporized acid. She slammed both of her trembling hands flat onto the granite counter. Bam! Punctuating the sudden end of the roar with a physical concussive strike that sent a shockwave up her wrists to her elbows. She stood there, panting heavily, her chest heaving with desperate gasps of the overly oxygenated air. Her eyes were wide, bloodshot, and locked in a psychotic glare at the towering reptiles. The kitchen plunged into a dead, ringing silence. The only sound was the frantic hammering of Chloe's own pulse in her ears. Leo was completely frozen. His jaw hung slightly open, a fresh string of thick purple saliva suspended motionless in the air. His ears, small leathery flaps tightly integrated into the sides of his armoured skull, were pinned flat against his head in an instinctive defensive posture. The golden slit pupils of his eyes had blown wide open, swallowing the iris in a sea of black. To her right, Wyatt had violently scrambled backward. His heavy spiked tail knocked a thick metal bar stool completely over in his frantic haste to retreat. He was now pressed hard against the massive stainless steel refrigerator, his posture entirely transformed. He wasn't coiled to spring. He wasn't maintaining his centre of gravity. He was actively trying to compress his 7-foot, 300-pound frame into a smaller target. They were staring at her not with the predatory amusement from 30 seconds prior, but with profound, paralysing evolutionary confusion. The biological math was spectacularly failing in their adolescent brains. The soft, squishy, furless thing that smelled sharply of cold sweat and fear had suddenly exploded with the territorial, unyielding aggression of a cornered dread beast. Prey did not hold their ground. Prey did not make loud, confrontational noises. Prey ran. Chloe didn't let up. The adrenaline dump was a toxic narcotic in her veins, making her limbs feel artificially light and dangerously powerful, masking the severe trembling in her knees. She pointed a rigid, shaking finger directly at the obsidian floor in front of the food vats. "Sit! Down!" she snarled. Her vocal cords were utterly wrecked. The words dropped an entire octave into a gravelly, abrasive rasp that barely sounded human. It sounded like two cinder blocks grinding together. Leo blinked slowly, fighting through his shock. He looked at her rigidly extended finger, then traced the line back to her furiously set jaw. He swallowed hard, a highly visible lump moving down his thick, muscular throat. Slowly, carefully, as if moving a fraction too fast might trigger another explosive shockwave from the unpredictable ape, the apex predator lowered his immense bulk onto the floor. He crossed his thick legs awkwardly, his obsidian claws retracting completely into their sheaths. Wyatt immediately followed suit. He shuffled forward from the refrigerator, keeping his massive head lowered, deliberately averting his gaze, and sat beside his brother. He stared fixedly at the scuff marks on Chloe's cheap work boots. Chloe reached back and grabbed a heavy metal serving spoon, the handle cold, solid, and comforting in her sweaty palm. She dug violently into the vat, scooping up a massive 5-pound chunk of the bloody protein mix. She slapped it into Leo's bowl with a wet, heavy thud. She repeated the process for Wyatt, the sickeningly wet, slapping sound echoing loudly in the tense, quiet room. The smell of sulphur and raw marrow turned her stomach, but she forced herself to breathe through her mouth. "Eat!" she barked, coughing slightly on the tea. The cubs didn't hesitate for a microsecond. They leaned forward and began devouring the meat. They ate with rapid, nervous, uncoordinated bites, completely abandoning their previous slow, arrogant chewing. Occasionally they shot, terrified, upward glances at her from beneath their heavy brow ridges, checking to ensure she wasn't preparing to strike. Chloe stood over them, the heavy serving spoon gripped tightly like a primitive club. The adrenaline tide was already beginning to recede, leaving behind a cold, shaky, nauseating exhaustion in her core. Her legs wanted to buckle, but she didn't break her stance. She stood tall, her shoulders squared, a fragile monument to human audacity. Holy shit, she thought, the cynical voice in her head returning, laced with disbelief and a touch of manic awe. If they realize I'm about to pass out, they're going to eat me. Out in the shadowed, carpeted hallway, completely unseen by the human or the traumatized cubs, Arthur and Beatrice stood perfectly, breathlessly still. They had returned early. Beatrice had left her encrypted data key for the orbital gala on her vanity. They had walked silently through the airlock just in time to hear the metallic crash of the heavy vats from the kitchen, instantly followed by a sound that made the coarse, sensory bristles on their thick hides stand straight up in primal alarm. They had crept down the hall, their deep-seated predatory instincts flaring, fully preparing to intervene and peel their unruly, lethal offspring off the fragile human remains. Instead, they had peered around the edge of the hallway's decorative arch, just in time to see the small, squishy primate inflate her chest and unleash a concussive blast of unhinged, violent fury. The sheer acoustic force of it had caused Arthur, a 9-foot galactic warlord, to instinctively take a sharp step backward. Now the two behemoths were pressed flat against the wall, hiding behind a sculpted obsidian pillar like frightened prey. Beatrice looked at Arthur. Her golden eyes were impossibly wide, the pupils dilated to the very edge of the iris, mirroring her son's terror. She slowly reached out, her hand shaking slightly, and grasped her husband's thick forearm. Her grip was tight enough to leave bruising beneath his tough hide. "Arthur," she whispered, her voice barely a fragmented vibration in the air. What was that?" Arthur stared unblinkingly at the polished wall separating them from the kitchen. He listened intently to the quiet, highly compliant chewing of his normally uncontrollable destructive sons and the heavy, ragged, menacing breathing of the human standing over them. "I don't know," Arthur whispered back, his voice trembling, stripping away centuries of aristocratic pride. He looked down at his own massive, heavily clawed hands, suddenly feeling profoundly vulnerable in his own home. "But whatever you do, Beatrice, do not make eye contact with it. Adrenaline is a biological loan with a brutal interest rate, and Chloe's debt was coming due." As the two massive alien adolescents scraped their bowls clean with long purple tongues, the fire in Chloe's veins began to cool into a shaky, nauseating chill. Her knees trembled so violently she had to lock them straight to stay standing. The stainless steel serving spoon in her right hand felt like it weighed 50 pounds. Her throat throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, every swallow feeling like she was dragging sandpaper over bruised tissue. She had just screamed at apex predators in their own territory. "If they realize I'm about to pass out, they'll eat me," Chloe thought, the cynical voice in her head ringing loud and clear. "Keep the bluff going. You are the apex ape. Act like it." Leo finished first. He didn't drop his bowl or push it away. He sat perfectly still, his massive scaled hands resting lightly on his knees, and looked up at her through the thick bristly ridges above his eyes. The defiance was gone. In its place was a cautious, almost reverent curiosity. The biological hierarchy of the room had shifted violently, and his adolescent brain was scrambling to map the new boundaries. "Done," Leo clicked, his voice a subdued rumble. Wyatt hastily licked the last smear of blood from his vat and echoed his brother. Chloe swallowed hard, ignoring the razor blade pain in her pharynx. She pointed the heavy spoon toward the sink. "Bowls, in the basin, wash them." Leo blinked. In his entire privileged existence, it was highly unlikely he had ever washed a dish. He looked at the sink, then back at the tiny, terrifying human. Slowly he stood up. He picked up his vat, his claws gingerly gripping the metal, and shuffled over to the deep ceramic basin. Wyatt followed a second later. Chloe watched, her chest tight, as the two 7-foot behemoths awkwardly fumbled with a touch-sensitive faucet, splashing water over their slate-grey forearms. They scrubbed the metal with clumsy diligence. "Good," Chloe rasped. She cleared her throat, wincing. "Now, the living room, we clean up the mess." She turned her back on them. It was a massive gamble, turning her back on creatures that could snap her spine with a casual swat, but it was necessary. Alpha predators didn't check their six in their own den. She walked out of the kitchen with heavy, deliberate steps, praying they wouldn't pounce. They didn't. She heard the soft, shuffling pad click of their heavy feet, following a respectful distance behind her. The living room was exactly as destroyed as she had left it. The shredded cushions, the displaced rhino leather furniture, the mangled remains of the multi-thousand-credit housekeeping drone. The shattered glass orb glittered dangerously under the recessed lighting. "Put the couches back," Chloe pointed. Leo and Wyatt moved without hesitation. What would have taken 3 burly human movers an hour to accomplish, the cubs managed in seconds. They gripped the massive couches and hauled them into position with effortless, silent strength. Chloe walked over to the shattered glass. She knelt down, intending to pick up the larger shards, but a massive grey hand intercepted her. Wyatt dropped to his knees beside her. Up close he smelled of ozone and wet stone. He didn't look at her face. Instead, he swept his thick, calloused palm across the floor, gathering the razor-sharp shards into a pile. The glass dug into his skin, but it didn't even leave a scratch. His hide was essentially organic Kevlar. He scooped the shards into his cupped hands and carried them to the waste recycler chute in the wall. Chloe watched him, a bizarre knot of emotion tightening in her chest. They were terrifying monsters, yes, but they were also just kids. Spoiled, bored, neglected kids left alone in a sterile penthouse with too much energy and zero boundaries. They didn't need a playmate. They needed a wall to bounce against. She had just provided a titanium one. "Sit," Chloe commanded, gesturing to the newly arranged couches. The cubs practically scrambled to comply, their heavy frames sinking into the leather cushions. They sat stiffly, hands on their knees, watching her every move. Chloe walked over to the large solitary armchair positioned perfectly in front of the massive holovision screen. It was clearly Arthur's chair. It was imposing, elevated, and commanded the room. She sank into it. The leather was cold and stiff, meant for a much larger, heavier body, but she rested her arms on the wide armrests and stared back at the boys. "Screen on," Chloe croaked. "Documentaries, nature." The holovision flickered to life, projecting a 3-dimensional image of a terrestrial jungle into the center of the room. The ambient sounds of distant birds and rainfall filled the tense silence. The boys watched the hologram, occasionally shooting sidelong glances at Chloe. She didn't relax. She kept her posture straight, her eyes half-lidded but alert. She was exhausted down to the marrow of her bones, but she held the line. Outside the penthouse, in the sleek, silent corridor, the real apex predators were having a crisis. Arthur and Beatrice remained pressed against the wall, paralyzed by a bizarre cocktail of parental panic and primal dread. They had listened to the cleanup effort in utter disbelief. They had heard their destructive, unruly offspring, who routinely terrorized armored Khaitin nannies, quietly washing dishes and moving furniture. She turned her back on them, Beatrice whispered, her golden eyes wide. She deliberately exposed her cervical spine to Leo, and he did nothing. She is entirely fearless, Arthur murmured, adjusting his collar. He was sweating. Or completely psychotic. I read a data pad once on human history. They used to hunt persistence predators. They would simply walk after their prey until the prey collapsed from exhaustion. They're relentless. Did you hear the sound she made? Beatrice shuddered, her thick hide rippling. It wasn't a vocalization. It was a localized atmospheric disturbance. I felt it in my primary hearts. Arthur swallowed hard. We cannot go in there. We live here, Arthur. Not right now, we don't. If we enter, we disrupt the established dominance hierarchy. If she perceives us as a threat to her new territory... Arthur let the sentence hang. He didn't want to find out if the tiny pink primate could replicate that roar. We will return to the elevator. We will wait 10 minutes. Then we will cycle the airlock loudly as if we have just arrived. Beatrice nodded fervently. Yes, good plan. Very tactical. The two 9-foot behemoths, wearing clothes that cost more than a small spacecraft, carefully tiptoed down the corridor, wincing at every soft squeak of their expensive boots on the floorboards, terrified of waking the wrath of the babysitter. Exactly 12 minutes later, the heavy pneumatic seals of the front airlock engaged. A loud mechanical hiss echoed through the penthouse, followed by the heavy thunk of the deadbolts sliding back. Chloe blinked heavily, pulling herself out of a dangerous micro-sleep. Her neck was stiff from the oversized chair. She sat up straight, instantly bracing herself. The adrenaline, which had ebbed to a low hum, spiked again. The parents were home. She stood up just as Arthur and Beatrice rounded the corner into the living room. Chloe immediately noticed a change in their posture. When they had left hours ago, they had carried themselves like royalty inspecting a dirty stable. They had loomed. Now their shoulders were slightly hunched. They kept their hands visible. Beatrice was actively avoiding eye contact, suddenly fascinated by a piece of abstract metal art on the wall. Arthur stopped at the edge of the sunken living room. He looked at his sons, who were sitting quietly on the couch, watching a holographic documentary about Earth's deep-sea vents. He looked at the spotless room. He looked at the waste recycler, where the destroyed drone had vanished without a trace. Then he looked at Chloe. He forced a smile that showed entirely too many serrated teeth, but it lacked any aggressive intent. It was the smile of a man trying very hard not to startle a venomous snake. Chloe, Arthur said, his voice dropping a register, losing the booming authority it held earlier. We have returned. Is everything acceptable? Chloe stepped down into the living area. Her legs felt like lead, but her face was a mask of bored professionalism. She smoothed down the front of her wrinkled polyester uniform. Everything is fine, Mr. Arthur, she said, her voice coming out as a raspy, damaged croak. Both parents flinched slightly at the sound. The boys had their protein rations. We had a minor incident with a housekeeping drone, but the boys were very helpful in cleaning it up. Beatrice darted a look at Leo. They cleaned it up? Yes, Chloe said flatly. She didn't elaborate. Let them wonder. They have been sitting quietly for the last hour. Leo turned his massive head toward his mother. He gave a short, high-pitched click, a submissive greeting, and then immediately looked back at the holovision, as if seeking Chloe's permission to speak further. Chloe gave a microscopic nod. Leo stayed silent. Arthur cleared his throat, a sound like gravel grinding in a cement mixer. I see. Exceptional. We have struggled to find caregivers who can enforce structure. You possess a remarkable presence, Chloe. I have 2 younger brothers back in Sector 4, Chloe lied effortlessly. You learn to project. Beatrice finally looked at her. The golden eyes held genuine awe. Your species is small, yet your territorial projection is immense. We are deeply impressed. Thank you, Ma'am, Chloe said. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her datapad. My shift ended 10 minutes ago. If you could authorize the transfer, I need to catch the midnight tram back to the residential ring. Of course, immediately, Arthur said. He moved with sudden, frantic energy, tapping the terminal on his wrist. Standard rate was 300 credits for the evening. Correct, Chloe watched him type. Arthur paused. He looked at his quiet, subdued sons, then back at the small, fragile-looking ape who had somehow subjugated them. He tapped a few more buttons. Chloe's datapad chirped. She looked down at the screen. The transfer notification glowed green in the dim light. Transfer complete. 1,500 credits. Chloe's breath caught in her ruined throat. 1,500. That wasn't just the atmospheric tax. That was the tax. 2 months of rent. And enough left over to buy real hydroponic vegetables instead of the synthetic paste she'd been eating since Tuesday. She looked up at Arthur. Her expression remained neutral, but her grip on the datapad tightened. Mr. Arthur, there seems to be a mistake. This is 5 times the agreed amount. Arthur held up a massive, placating hand. No mistake, Chloe. Consider the excess a retainer and hazard pay for the drone. We would very much like to employ you again, if you are willing. We understand if our boys are too demanding. He was begging her. The towering 9-foot apex predator in the bespoke suit was begging the exhausted human woman not to quit. Chloe looked at the boys. Leo met her gaze, gave a slow, respectful blink and looked away. She had established dominance. Next time she wouldn't have to scream. A look would probably suffice. They aren't demanding, Chloe said smoothly, sliding the datapad back into her pocket. They just needed boundaries. I'm available next Thursday. Same rate. The new rate. Thursday is perfect, Beatrice interjected quickly, relief washing over her harsh reptilian features. We will ensure a new drone is purchased by then, for them to destroy, if it pleases you. That won't be necessary. We'll be doing puzzles. Chloe turned and walked toward the airlock. She didn't look back. Have a good night. Boys, it's time for sleep cycles. Yes, Chloe, Leo and Wyatt rumbled in unison. The airlock hissed open. Chloe stepped out into the bright, sterile corridor of the penthouse ring. The heavy doors sealed shut behind her, with a final echoing thud. Alone in the quiet hall, the facade finally dropped. Chloe slumped against the polished metal wall, letting out a long, ragged exhale that burned all the way up her trachea. She closed her eyes, feeling the cool metal against her sweating forehead. Her legs finally gave out and she slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor, her knees pulled to her chest. She pressed her face into her hands and let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh. It was hysterical, entirely devoid of the alpha predator cool she had just projected. She was alive. She wasn't eaten, and she was rich, or at least rich enough for Sector 4. Chloe pulled her datapad out again, staring at the glowing number. 1,500 credits. She rubbed her raw, aching throat. She would probably be drinking warm tea for a week, and her voice might never sound exactly the same. But as she hauled herself up off the floor and began the long walk to the orbital tram, a small, cynical smile touched her lips. The galaxy was full of terrifying things with sharp teeth and thick hides. But they were learning a very important lesson about Earth. We might be small, we might be soft, but back us into a corner, mess with our paycheck, and the hairless apes will always roar the loudest. Did you enjoy this dive into human audacity? If Chloe's feral roar resonated with your inner ape, hit that like button and share this story with a fellow sci-fi fan. Subscribe to the channel for more grounded, gritty HFY tales, where humans prove why we survived Earth. Drop a comment below on how you would handle babysitting apex alien predators. Stay loud, stay human, and I'll see you in the next video.